23. Rowing for Liberty. In Berlin, the preparations for the Olympics had begun several years before, back when Joe and Roger were first trying out for the freshman boat. At first, the leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, did not want to host the games at all. Almost everything about the idea, in fact, had offended him. The very heart of the Olympic ideal was that athletes of all nations and all races should come together and compete on equal terms. But Hitler and his Nazi party believed that the Aryan people were superior to all others. The notion of Jews, blacks, and members of other races from around the world visiting his country was revolting to Hitler. Once he rose to power in 1933, however, his feelings about the Olympics began to change. Hitler had grand plans for Germany. The country was devastated after its defeat in the First World War. The German economy had collapsed. The country's army had been outlawed. Now Hitler wanted his nation to rebuild its military might, reclaim the territory it had lost in the past, and expand further across Europe and the world. He wanted the people he considered his race, the Aryan race, to reign supreme over all people. Yet he needed time to build up strength. If other nations discovered his plans before he had a chance to rebuild, they could crush those plans, so he had to keep his goals secret. One of his chief advisors, Joseph Goebbels, convinced Hitler that hosting the Olympics would be an ideal distraction. It would give the Nazis a chance to portray Germany as a civilized and modern state. The Olympics could be used to convince the world that Hitler governed a powerful but friendly nation, a country that the larger world should recognize and respect. As they put on a show of peace and progress, the Nazis could quietly restore Germany's military might and prepare to conquer Europe. Berlin decked out for the Olympics. Once Hitler committed to the effort, the Olympics became a major public works project. Thousands of young German men transformed a 325-acre section outside Berlin into the Reichssportfeld, the site of the Games. They constructed a great Olympic stadium large enough to hold 110,000 people. They built a swimming stadium, an equestrian stadium, a gymnasium, tennis courts, restaurants, and more. The buildings were built with natural, German stone, and the workers were all Germans too. To get jobs, Hitler decreed they had to be registered citizens and members of the Aryan race. The Olympic rowing course lay 15 miles to the southeast, in the leafy and pleasant lakeside community of Grunau. The rowing, canoeing, and kayaking events were all set to take place on the Langer See, one of several lakes fed by the Dom River. The Langer See, with its deep blue water, had long been the center of water sports in Berlin. In 1925, there were dozens of rowing clubs based in and around Grunau. Some were exclusively Jewish, some only Aryan, and some happily mixed. As the Olympics approached, however, all this changed. On September 15, 1935, Hitler stood before the leaders of the German government and announced 3 new laws. First, the Nazi Party emblem, the swastika, was to become the official flag of Germany. Second, only people of German or related blood could be citizens of Germany. The third law was aimed directly at Jews. Among other things, it prohibited the marriage of Jews and non-Jews. In the next few months and years, Germany's government would add dozens of additional laws restricting every aspect of the lives of German Jews, taking away even their most basic freedoms. Across Germany, in towns and cities, signs proclaiming Juden unerwünscht Jews not welcome appeared over the entrances to hotels, drugstores, public swimming pools, and shops of all sorts. Books written by Jewish authors and others the Nazis did not like were burned in public places. In Grunau, Jewish rowing clubs were banned. Other clubs were threatened if they did not kick out their Jewish rowers. Men who had rowed with one another for a lifetime began to turn their backs on their former crewmates and neighbors. Forbidding signs went up over the doors of shell houses. Doors were locked, keys changed. These frightening developments had not gone unnoticed outside Germany. In the United States, There was a movement to boycott the 1936 Olympics in protest over the treatment of Jews in Germany. On November 21, 1935, 10,000 anti-Nazi demonstrators marched peacefully through New York City, calling for America to stay home from the Games. In December, the Amateur Athletic Union of the United States voted on a new resolution. If the vote passed, the group would send a three-man committee to Germany to investigate claims that Nazis were mistreating Jews. But the vote failed. There would be no investigation. The boycott effort was effectively dead, and American athletes prepared to go to Berlin for the 1936 Olympics. After Princeton, the New York Athletic Club invited Ulbrichtson and the crew to use its training facilities at Travers Island, an elegant spot on the nearby Long Island Sound. The club had a formal dining room and an oyster bar, a full-featured gymnasium, a boathouse, a baseball diamond, a bowling alley, a barbershop, and every conceivable sort of athletic training equipment. The boys had easy access to excellent rowing water on the Sound. And best of all for boys from the fields, forests, and small towns of the Pacific Northwest, it was just a few miles from the glamour and excitement of New York City. The nation was in the grip of the greatest heat wave in its history, but the boys didn't let the sweltering heat stop them from visiting major sites like Rockefeller Center and Wall Street, the source of the great stock market crash of 1929 that had begun the Great Depression. They rode the subway out to the beach at Coney Island. They made their way through the crowds on the boardwalk. They shoveled down 5-cent hot dogs at Nathan's, ate cotton candy, guzzled ice-cold Coca-Cola, gobbled peanuts, rode the hair-raising Cyclone roller coaster. And in Times Square one afternoon, a tall, somewhat heavy man rushed up to Shorty, took a good look, and said, "You're Shorty Hunt." He looked at the other boys. "You fellows are the Washington crew, aren't you?" He gushed that he had recognized Shorty from a picture in the newspaper. For the first time, the boys suddenly felt like celebrities. And something else began to dawn on them. They were beginning to understand that they were not just the University of Washington crew anymore. They were America's crew. The one their jerseys was about to be replaced with USA. They were rowing for something larger now. This fact struck Bobby much as he was sitting in the shade under a tree in a wide-open field on Travers Island, opening an envelope from his father. The envelope contained a letter listing the addresses of the relatives he hoped to visit in Europe, as he had requested. But it also contained a second, sealed envelope labeled, "Read this in a private place." Now, alarmed, Mach opened the second envelope and read its contents. Gaston Mach told his son that when he met his relatives in Europe, he was going to learn for the first time that he was Jewish. Bobby sat under the tree, brooding for a long while. He was not upset that he was Jewish. He was bothered by the fact that his father had felt it necessary to conceal his heritage from his friends, his neighbors, and even his own children. Now Bobby was heading off to race in a country that was gradually making it illegal even to be Jewish at all. For Joe, the moment of clarity came on the 86th floor of the new Empire State Building. None of the boys had ever ridden an elevator more than a few floors in a hotel, and the rapid ascent to the 86th floor of the Empire State Building thrilled them nearly as much as the roller coaster out at Coney Island. Standing on the observation deck, Joe looked out at the many spires of New York rising through the smoke and steam and haze. He had never seen anything like it, and he did not know whether he found it beautiful or frightening. He dropped a nickel in a telescope for a better view of the Brooklyn Bridge, then swept the telescope across Lower Manhattan and out to the distant Statue of Liberty. In a few days, he would be sailing under her on his way to Germany, a place where liberty was not a given right. The headlines about the Nazis were impossible to ignore. Joe didn't know all the details, but as he understood it, liberty was under some kind of assault in Germany. For the first time, Joe realized that he and the boys would not just be rowing for gold. They would be rowing for a way of life, a shared set of values. Liberty was perhaps the most important of those values. But to the boys from Washington, America also stood for trust in one another, for mutual respect, for humility, and for fair play. These ideals were part of what had drawn them together as a crew. And they were about to show the world the power of those ideals when they took to the water at Grunnow. George Pocock spent the last few days before their departure for Germany carefully sanding down the hull of the Husky Clipper, then applying coat after coat of marine varnish, buffing each coat until the shell glistened. He wasn't doing it just for looks. The race in Berlin could come down to fractions of a second. He wanted the shell to have the fastest racing surface possible. On July 13th, Pocock supervised the boys as they carefully loaded the 62-foot Husky Clipper onto a long truck and drove it through the heart of New York City with a police escort. They pulled up alongside the SS Manhattan, the 668-foot-long ship that would transport 334 members of the U.S. Olympic team to Germany, and searched for a place to stow their shell. It took them an hour to figure out a way to hoist it up to the boat deck. Then they tied it down, covered it with a tarp, and hoped and prayed that no one would mistake it for a bench. The SS Manhattan. On the boat to Berlin. 2 days later, with cameras rolling and flashbulbs popping, the boys bounded up the gangplank and onto the Manhattan at 10:30 in the morning. They were giddy, charged with excitement. After stowing their gear and meeting some of the other athletes, they joined hundreds of others waving American flags up on deck. As the noon departure time approached, more than 10,000 spectators crowded onto the pier at the edge of the Hudson River. Blimps and airplanes circled overhead. Black smoke began to billow out of the red, white, and blue smokestacks of the Manhattan. The crowd on the dock, waving their hats over their heads, began a thunderous chant, "Ray! Ray! Ray! For the USA!" A band struck up a tune, the lines were cast off, and the Manhattan began to back slowly out into the Hudson. Joe and the other boys rushed to the rails, waving their flags, taking up the chant. The whistles on tugs and ferries and nearby ships began to shriek. Out on the river, fireboats let loose with their sirens and shot white plumes of water high into the air. As the boat passed the Statue of Liberty and cruised out into the Atlantic, Joe stayed on deck, leaning on the rail, enjoying the cool air. He was trying to remember everything so he could tell Joyce all about it when he returned home. Hours later, when the sun had begun to set in the west, Joe retreated into the ship, looking for the rest of the boys and food. The Manhattan, her lights ablaze and loud with music and the laughter of young people at play, sailed forward, out into the darkness of the North Atlantic, on its way to Hitler's Germany. Joe's Olympic jersey. 24, fighting, fuming, and coming together. As Joe drifted into sleep aboard the Manhattan that night, the first light of dawn crept over Berlin, where Nazi police and soldiers were marching groups of men, women, and children through the streets at gunpoint. The arrests had begun hours earlier, under the veil of night. The Nazis were moving gypsy families living in shanties and wagons out of a Berlin suburb and into detention camps. In time, they would be sent east to death camps and murdered. Their removal was just one more step in a process that had been unfolding for months. The Nazis were transforming Berlin into something like a vast movie set, an artificial world with all the horror and anti-Semitism hidden away. The signs prohibiting Jews from entering public facilities had been taken down and stored for later use. A fiercely anti-Jewish newspaper had been temporarily removed from newsstands. 1,400 homeless people had been rounded up and removed from the streets. Shop windows had been polished. Streets had been swept and reswept, trains freshly painted, broken windows replaced. Books banned by the Nazis temporarily reappeared in bookshop windows. Joseph Goebbels, the man who helped convince Hitler to host the games, handed locals a script for their performance when they met foreigners, instructing them to be charming, easygoing, and welcoming to all. On the Manhattan, the trip over was difficult for Don Hume and Roger Morris. Hume had developed some kind of cold in Princeton. Now he and Morris became terribly seasick. But Joe was enjoying himself. He was meeting other Olympians and eating all the food he could find. The athletes were expected to remain in the tourist class areas of the boat. First class was supposed to be for the sort of people Joe had seen on the golf courses at Princeton. But the boys didn't think much of this class business. Soon they were prowling on plush carpeting through a maze of corridors leading to spacious cabins with wood paneling, a smoking lounge with a wood-burning fireplace, and a grand ballroom with high white plastered ceilings, marble columns, and delicately hand-painted murals. They found the first-class dining room with its own orchestra balcony and dining tables draped with elegant tablecloths. And they found the grand salon, where movies were shown every evening. Soon they discovered that when 5 or 6 large young men who just happened to be Olympic oarsmen sat in the grand salon, nobody was about to remove them. So they took to visiting the upper decks every evening, stopping on their way into the grand salon to swipe a platter of hors d'oeuvres and then passing it around as they watched the show. One afternoon, Joe returned to his cabin to find his new rowing uniform. There was a pair of white shorts and an elegant white jersey with a U.S. Olympic shield. Red, white, and blue ribbons were stitched around the neck and down the front. The fabric of the jersey was smooth, almost like silk. He held it up for a better look, and it shimmered in the light streaming in through his porthole. The jersey immediately meant the world to Joe. He had never been beaten. He had never been obliged to follow the old custom of surrendering his jersey to a rival oarsman. He had no intention of letting this jersey be the first. Joe Rance was taking this one home. On the morning of July 24th, the ship docked in Hamburg, Germany. The boys awoke early to unload the husky clipper. They were edgy, anxious to get off the boat. Except for Don Hume, who was still fighting some kind of cold, they had put on 5 or 6 pounds each during the 9-day voyage. They were starting to feel flabby and out of shape. They wanted to stretch their arms and climb into a racing shell. By noon they were on a train to Berlin, and when they arrived in the city's palatial Old Lurder station that afternoon, they were stunned. Thousands of Germans had packed the station to get a glimpse of them. A black locomotive with swastikas emblazoned on its sides loomed nearby. A brass band struck up a song. The athletes boarded open-top buses and followed a parade route through the city. Tens of thousands of Germans cheered and waved Olympic, Nazi, and occasionally even American flags. Later that afternoon, the boys finally arrived at what would be their home for the next several weeks, a police cadet training academy in Köpenick, a quaint village a few miles away from the Olympic rowing course. Unlike most of the ancient buildings in town, the police academy was modern-looking, all glass, steel, and concrete. Most of the cadets had been moved out to make room for the American oarsmen and others. Unfortunately, even though the building was brand new, it was cold and there were no hot showers. The U.S. Olympic team arrives in Berlin. The next morning, the boys awoke early, eager to get out on the water. After breakfast, a gray German army bus transported them 3 miles down the Langer See to the racecourse in Grunau. When they arrived, the boys discovered that they were going to share a shell house with the German crew, a fine new brick and stucco building called House West. Over the entrance, an American flag and a Nazi flag faced each other. The German oarsmen were courteous, but hardly gushing with enthusiasm to meet the boys from Washington. They seemed to be a bit older, and they were exceptionally fit and disciplined. They were almost military in the way they carried themselves. When the boys finally took to the water, the results were spectacularly disappointing. Their timing was all off. Their poles were weak and inefficient. The Canadian and Australian crews, practicing sprints, blew past them with smirks on their faces. Ulbrichtsen had never seen them row so poorly. The boys had gained a lot of weight, and almost all of them had colds. Don Hume seemed to be getting worse, and the chilling winds on the Langer See and cold, drafty police barracks hardly helped. Over the next few days, the boys fell into a routine, rowing badly in the morning and then heading into Berlin for the afternoon. They took in shows, visited tourist sites, and bought bratwurst sausages from street vendors. Over and over again, ordinary Germans greeted them by extending their right hands palms down and shouting, "Heil Hitler." The boys took to responding by extending their own hands and saluting their own leader, President Roosevelt. They'd shout, "Heil Roosevelt!" The Germans, for the most part, pretended not to notice. But those afternoon jaunts weren't enough to improve the crew's morale. They were still rowing terribly. Gordy Adam and Don Hume were still sick. By July 29th, Hume was too ill to row. Too ill, in fact, to get out of bed. Ulbrichtsen put Don Coy, a substitute who had made the trip, in at the critical stroke position. But when they practiced with Coy in the stroke seat, the boat just didn't feel right. Ulbrichtsen was deeply concerned now. As crews from other nations arrived at Grunnow, he and Pocock were spending a lot of time down by the water, studying the competition. The Germans had to be taken very seriously. The Italians also looked like a threat. They had lost to California in the 1932 Olympics by only 0.2 of a second. Now 4 of the rowers from that boat were back for another chance. The Japanese crew, from Tokyo Imperial University, rowed in a small shell, with short oars and small blades, and they averaged just 145 pounds per oarsman. But they could accelerate at an astonishing rate. The Australians did not boast the best technique, but they had fire and strength. Above all, though, Pocock and Ulbrichtsen believed the British were the boat to beat. Rowing was traditionally a British sport, and the oarsmen and coxswain that Britain had sent to the 1936 Olympics were the best of the British best. William George Ranald Mundell Laurie, also known as Ran, was perhaps the best British stroke of his generation. He was 188 pounds of power, grace, and keen intelligence. Along with coxswain John Noel Duckworth, a small man with great heart, Laurie had piloted his crew to 3 major victories in a row. In the famed boat race on the Thames River in London, they'd already raced and won in front of 500,000 to 1 million fans. To Ulbrichtsen, that experience alone had to give the British boys an edge. What most concerned Ulbrichtsen about the British boys, though, was their strategy. They liked to do exactly what the Washington boys did so well. They excelled at sitting back but staying close, rowing hard but slow, then mowing down their opponents in the end. Duckworth operated an awful lot like Bobby Mach, and Ran Laurie handled the stroke or an awful lot like Don Hume. It was going to be interesting to see what happened when 2 crews playing the same game met on the Langer Sea. The 1936 Games opened officially on August 1st, in a spectacular ceremony at the Olympic Stadium, but the rowing competition would not begin until August 12th. As the boys waited, the weather on the Langer Sea turned positively wintry. A cold, cutting wind blew down the racecourse. The boys rowed in sweatshirts, their legs slathered in goose grease to protect them from the chill. The preliminary heats were less than 2 weeks away, but they still hadn't regained their form. Their timing was off. They caught crabs. They were out of shape, and Don Hume wasn't getting any healthier. Since he'd first gotten sick at Princeton, he had never really stopped coughing and dragging around. Unless he got healthy, Ulbrichtsen figured they would not have a chance. And then there was the matter of the race course. Ulbrichtsen was not happy with how it had been laid out. There were 6 lanes. If there was a strong wind on race day, the 2 outermost lanes would be so exposed that the crews stuck there would have a much harder row. Lanes 1 through 4, on the other hand, stuck close to the southern shore of the lake. They were protected from the wind through most of the course. The crews assigned to these lanes would basically have a 2-length advantage over the boats on the outside. Ulbrichtsen wanted the outer lanes eliminated, but German Olympic officials rejected the idea. As the heats approached, Ulbrichtsen grounded the boys. There would be no more trips into Berlin or anywhere else. The boys began to get tense and fidgety again. Nerves began to grow raw among the other crews as well. The Aussies made no effort to conceal their contempt for the Brits. The Brits could not even look at the Germans. They remembered fighting them in the last war, and they were worried a second one was coming soon. At lunchtime one day, the tensions erupted. The different crews ate together, and it had become a tradition for them to sing national songs during meals. When it came time for the Yugoslavian crew to rise and sing, they launched into an odd rendition of Yankee Doodle. There was something about the way they sang that Chuck Day did not appreciate. He was convinced they were insulting the United States of America, and he would not stand for that. Day bolted out of his seat and plowed into the Yugoslavians, fists flying. Bobby Mach charged right in behind him, going for the biggest man on the crew. Right behind Mach came the rest of the Washington boys, and behind them, just for the fun of it, the entire Australian team. The German crew rushed to the side of the Yugoslavians. Boys shoved other boys. They threw chairs and hurled insults. A few more fists flew. Everyone was yelling, but because of all the different languages, nobody could understand what anybody else was saying. Finally, the Dutch national crew dove in and settled everyone down. In the last few days before the first preliminary heat, the American boys worked on centering and calming themselves. None of them wanted to waste his chance at a gold medal, and none wanted to waste it for the others. All along, Joe Rance had figured he was the weak link in the crew. He'd been added to the boat last. He had often struggled to master the technical side of the sport, but what Joe didn't know was that every boy in the boat felt exactly the same way. Every one of them believed he was simply lucky to be rowing in the boat, that he didn't really measure up to the obvious greatness of the other boys, and that he might fail the others at any moment. None of them wanted to let that happen. The boys began to draw even closer together. They took to huddling on the float before and after workouts, talking about what, precisely, they could do to improve. They draped arms over one another's shoulders and talked through their race plan, speaking softly but with increasing confidence. They looked one another in the eye, speaking earnestly. They quoted Pocock to one another. They walked the shores of the lake, skipping stones, but the jokes and horseplay were gone now. They began to grow serious in a way they had never been before. Hume returned to the boat, and everything began to feel right again. They began to find their swing. Left to right, Joe Rance, Stub McMillan, Bobby Mach, Chuck Day, Shorty Hunt. They were back. All they needed now, Pocock told them on August 10th, was a little competition. And they were about to get it.